This library has a large collection of about 250,000 volumes. Most of them are old and rare. It's not a regular library. It's not a library, open library for the public. It's a research library, only researchers coming in that they want to look up something in a very old and rare book that they can't find in other places. I just brought up from the collection one sample of each item to give the description of the development over these generations. I prepared a few pages of the 12th, 13th century, some pages of the Talmud that are written on parchment. These pages that are written on parchment we have found many years ago in binding of old books. If we found in a book a very soft cover, we were suspicious maybe inside there are very old items. Sometimes we found manuscripts of very old Talmud or anything else. Here are 3 pages of the Talmud written on parchment in the 12th or 13th century. We don't have the exact date, but they are written in the 12th or 13th century. Then they have started writing the Talmud on paper. I brought up a few samples of pages that are Talmud that are written on paper in the early 15th century. They are written in the middle, it's Talmud, and around is the commentary of Rashi. I brought up some 10 pages of that Talmud that someone wrote in the beginning of the 15th century. This is Masechet Kiddushin. The parchment are on Masechet Sanhedrin and Shvuot. So we have here some samples of the period when Talmud was not published yet. If they had Talmud, it was always only written on paper or on parchment. The first print of Talmud was in 1480s. It was the same time, 1482 and 1483 and 1484, those 3 years, they started publishing a Talmud in the same time in Spain and in Italy, in Soncino. The one that was published in Spain is much more valuable and unique and rare, since it was in Spain in 1482 was only 10 years before the expulsion of Jews of Spain. They was expelled and the Talmud was lost or burned or confiscated. So there is not even one copy of this Talmud on the world, only single pages here and there. I brought up 17 pages of this Talmud. This is the first page of Masechet Chagiga. In those days, they would not have a front page. The Talmud would start right away with the Talmud itself, and this is the first page. That is the beginning of Masechet Chagiga. In the same years, they have published in Italy, also in Soncino, a Talmud. That Talmud in Soncino is more available. I just brought up a few pages with the last pages of this Talmud. It was published in 1484. There is a few pages that I brought up of that Talmud. That's the first 2 Talmuds that was published. You could see also that it's very damaged with worms. We picked it out of a old binding. After this Talmud became very old, they didn't need it. Someone purchased a new Talmud, and the binding, he took old pages that he didn't need anymore, and he pasted it with glue, and he made out of it a binding. Because in those days, they did not have cardboard. So if they wanted to make a binding, it was either by wood, leather, or glued pages one to another. Pages, old pages they don't need anymore. All publishers in Italy was not Jewish. A Jew could not have there a printing house. But he hired Jewish people to work on it. He was just the owner of it. This edition of Sonsino, it was over a period of 4 years published, beginning in Sonsino, and then the printing house moved to Pizarro. Here you have a whole Talmud. It's the Talmud of Eruvin that was published already almost 30 years later, 25 years later, in the year of 1511 in Pizarro. That's a Talmud of Masechet Eruvin. As you see, it starts with the Masechet itself. There is no front page. But here you have the whole Masechet. Sometimes they would do calculations to pictures to show geometry in the commentary on the Talmud. They managed to do something, cut wood, and then they would print with it. That Talmud was started in Sonsino in 1484 and went on till 1911, and a little later till the end of it was before 1920. It wasn't published as a set. Each volume was published as a volume for itself. It was only right after that, in 1522, where Bomberg decided to print a set of the whole Talmud. That's already the second generation of publishing the Talmud. I've brought here one of the volumes of the Bomberg that we have, which is the last volume of the Talmud Nida, was published he published it 3 times. Since the Bomberg Shas, all Shas till today are all the same pages, never changed, because people just got used to these pages. If they would change, it would be hard. So they always stick to the same pages. Even if they added commentaries, they try as they could, at the best, as much as they could, to leave the same pages as it was then. He have published it in 1550. In 1546 till 1550, in those years. He wanted to start one new edition, but then came out the Gzeira of confiscating and burning all the Talmuds in Italy, and the 4th edition was already never published. So this edition of the Bomberg that he published 3 times, and the same format, the same pages, word for word, page for page, this is the base of all the Talmuds that was published for all the years till today. Till today, whenever they published a Masechet, they published on the same pages of the Bomberg Talmud, not as the earlier of Pizarro, which is somewhat different. Although that after they gave out the Gzeira of burning all the Talmud, they could not publish anymore the Talmud in Italy. The Gzeira started the dispute started in 1550. Then came in Italy, in Venice, came a second publisher that wanted to take over the market, the Jewish market. His name was Justinian. And in 1550, they have published twice the Rambam in Venice. One was Justinian and one was Bragadin, two publishers. And each one of them wanted to stop the other one and went to the government, to the court, with saying that he is a bad man and you should stop him. So the government got involved in the publication of Jewish books, and since they started discussing it, they decided to stop it all. So this dispute started in 1550, but in 1512, 13, 14, they already came out with the gzera of burning all the Talmud and confiscating it from the Jews. So therefore they could not publish anymore the Talmud in Italy. So they have started publishing it in the countries around Italy, not in Italy. The first publication of the Talmud later than 1510 was in Basel. It was in 1580. So I brought one copy of the Talmud, Masechet Nazir, that was published in 1580, but right after they couldn't publish anymore in Italy, and then they have started to publish the Talmud in other parts of the world, mainly in Poland, in Krakow and Lublin. In Poland, they opened the printing house in Krakow and Lublin. I have brought a copy of part of the Talmud that was published in Krakow in 1618. As you could see in those days, as I mentioned before, the binding was either from wood. This is the original binding of wood, that they would have a lock on it, and in the back they would have a string to open it. And so that's several masechtot. That's zvachim, and then it is menachot. Here you have the front page of Masechet Menachot, all published in Krakow, in Poland, in 1618. So that's where they have published the Masechtot in the next, I would say, 80, 90 years. The next real edition of the Talmud that was really edited, taken out all old mistakes and corrected, was in Amsterdam. That's already, they started working on it in Amsterdam in 1644, and they have worked on it for 4 years till 1648 in a little smaller format, smaller letters, but the text is very much corrected. Great sages, Jewish sages, edited it, and they found a lot of printing errors that they have corrected. It was in a later date where the founder of Hassidut Chabad, the Baal HaTanya, has published a edition of the Talmud in about 150 years later. It was published in Slavita. So when he published it, we have his original handwriting where he is writing instructions to the printer how they should print it. And he says by every little thing they should check against the Amsterdam edition, not the others, because the others have more errors, printing errors. But this does not have printing errors, so they should always check it according to this edition. They have published the Slavita Shas 4 times in Slavita over a period of 30, 40 years. So in those years, they have already published the Talmud in many places. The next real edition, where they have really checked it according to manuscripts and they added some commentaries, was the famous Vilna Shas. All our Talmuds that we have now are all built on the Vilna Shas. And there, again, it became a big fight between them and between a lot of rabbis on each side. Who has the right to really publish? Because in those years, if you publish twice, you lose and it doesn't work. So they wanted only one should publish. And they fought who should. Actually, Slavite was published by Hasidic people, and Vilna was by the Misnagdim. But I don't know that's the reason, but there was a big conflict. And this also ended up in the government got involved in it. I don't know if they was involved in the fight itself, but they got involved in the subject. And eventually, in 1836, they gave out a new order to close down all printing houses in Russia, and that Slavite and Vilna both was there, and they have permitted only two places to be a publishing house, a Jewish publishing house, one in Vilna and one was in Zhytomyr, and they both was under the supervision of the government. And since then, every book needs a clarification by a checking by the government people, the censor, what is called, what we know, the censor need to approve every book that was published. So that's also the story between the Slavite and Vilna. But that was in 1935 and 1936. The Vilna Shas that we are speaking is not by the father. It's already by the children of him. They have published it 50 years later, in 1884 and on. That's much later, and it's called by the widow and the children of Rome. His last name was Rome. So that's the famous Vilna Shas that all Shas today are copied of. This Shas is something that was started to be published 50 years later. The Admor Zaken published the Shas, and we have it there is a volume of all letters of the Admor Zaken with some of the copies of his writing, whatever we have published in this edition. So this edition has 3 pages, his own handwriting, where he is writing, I will just read it, to the great sage Maharam Moshe, the Rov of Slavite, about reprinting the Shas Bavli and the Turim in his very good publishing house. And then he gives him instruction how to do it. And the same thing is the earlier letter, also to him, about Be'esek Hatpatat Hashas. He is writing him that for every little part, they should check the new Talmud they are publishing against the Amsterdam, because this is very good corrected. After these letters of the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Tanya, to give instructions about the publication of Slavite in 1808, some 2 years later, in 1835, there was the 4th edition of the Slavite and the 1st edition of Vilna, where there was a dispute. Then, 50 years later, in 1886-85, the Vilna started publishing the new edition, a large edition, with a lot of additional commentaries. that they have added. They have in the front page a list of all the additions, the additional commentaries. Then they have a new edition of 103 editions of commentaries, short or long. And this is the famous Vilna Talmud that was published the first time in 1880, 4, 5, 6, which is about 80 years after the first publication in Slavite by the directive of the Alter Rebbe. This is mainly the history of writing Talmud and publishing Talmud over the years. There is only one more interesting point that we could say about the history of the Talmud. As we could see, all these Talmuds are in large format and they are published as a set. But people wanted to be able to have with them a small Masechet to be able to study where they go. In 1750, 1740, they have started printing small Talmuds. They are already not page by page of the Vilna. They are just made for people to take with them where they go. They should be able to learn. It's hard to take a large Masechet with you. So there are a lot of single volumes of Masechet that was published over the years. We have here one of the earliest one was published in Zolkva, which is published in 1746 in Galicia. So that's one of the earliest one. But there are many others that was published over the years. In nowadays, even the whole Shas they have in small format, and one could take with himself, and they have it in the whole Talmud. Even this whole Talmud is not so large, and they have much smaller also. But in general, the Talmud is larger, and here we have a sample of the single ones that was published. This is a general description of the Talmud, how it was developed from the 12th, 13th century when it was written on parchment until the 20th century, where they have mainly the Vilna Shas copies in large format or in small format. What we are doing here in the library for the last 7 years is editing a new edition of the Shulchan Aruch, of the Baal HaTanya. We have the first time it was published in 1800 and something. So this first publication, you could see only the text without explanation, and in several volumes. Then they gave out many volumes in 5 volumes, and sometimes they would have some notes on the side or on the bottom. But for the last 7 years, with a whole staff, we are publishing a new edition of this Talmud that you could see that in the bottom we have the footnotes explaining the sources for whatever he says. That's our main occupation for the last 7 years. You could see in every page there's all these footnotes to explain the source of the halachot for the Alter Rebbe, and sometimes cross footnotes to say where he explains in other places or things like that. So we have here 6 volumes came out, and they're all the same style. That's what the work in the library for the last couple of years. But that's a very old book, and it's interesting to hold it. And when we have to look up something, we check. That's why I have it locked up here, to be able, whenever I have a question, to check it, the text in the first edition. This is the first edition of the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe did both. He was working on the Talmud of publishing, and he was making this collection of giant work of the Shulchan Aruch.